The fluorescent lights inside the Halifax Tactical Surplus Depot buzzed with a low, electric hiss that seemed to vibrate straight through the concrete floor. Outside, a cold Atlantic wind rattled the corrugated steel walls of the warehouse, but inside, the air was still and heavy, thick with the smell of motor oil, wet kennel straw, and the particular tension that comes from 40 armed men trying not to look nervous around a row of caged dogs. Then a young woman walked through the side door alone, said 4 words nobody expected, and every working dog in the building went absolutely silent. The warehouse sat on the edge of the Burnside Industrial Park, a part of Dartmouth most people never bothered driving through, unless they had business there. Today it had business. Twice a year, the Atlantic Tactical K9 liquidation auction brought together private security contractors, mining operation safety directors, and a handful of wealthy property owners who wanted something with teeth guarding their assets. The dogs on the block weren't pets. They were retired military and RCMP working dogs, animals that had been trained to bite, track, and kill on command, and were now being sold off because they'd aged out, washed out, or simply broken in ways their handlers couldn't fix. Evelyn Marsh did not belong in that room, and she knew it. She was 24, dressed in a thrifted wool coat 2 sizes too big and scuffed winter boots, holding a manila envelope against her chest like it might fly away. Around her, men in tactical fleece and expensive parkas exchanged numbers like they were discussing hockey scores. 12,000, 15. A man near the front casually mentioned he'd just dropped 20 on a Czech shepherd for his client's oil sands camp, like it was nothing, like it was the cost of a decent truck. Evelyn's envelope held a certified check for $2,610. It was every cent of her savings, the money she'd been putting toward first, and last month's rent on a 1-bedroom near the hospital where she worked nights. She'd told her roommate she was looking at a car. She hadn't told anyone the truth because the truth sounded insane even in her own head. She had come to a military surplus auction to buy back her dead father's dog. She let her eyes close for a second, just long enough to remember him the way he used to be. 5 years ago, before any of this, the dog had been an awkward, oversized puppy who tripped over his own paws, chasing gulls on the breakwater in Shearwater. He belonged to her father, Master Corporal Daniel Marsh, a military working dog handler with the Canadian Armed Forces. The dog's name, back then, had simply been Birch. Named, her father always joked, because the pup had chewed through every fence post on the property like he was personally offended by it. Daniel and Birch were inseparable in a way that felt almost unfair to everyone else in the family. They trained together at 5 in the morning. They deployed together twice. When her father was home between postings, the 3 of them would sit on the back steps of their little base housing unit in Halifax, Birch's enormous head resting across Evelyn's lap, while her father told her the sanitized PG version of wherever he'd just come back from. Birch only ever fully obeyed one voice, her father's, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. 3 years ago, the calls stopped. The details the military gave Evelyn and her mother were thin, filtered through layers of operational security that never quite explained anything. What she did know, eventually second-hand, through a family liaison officer who looked like he hated his job, was that her father's unit had been caught in an ambush during a nighttime security operation overseas, the specifics of which were still, 3 years later, not releasable. Daniel Marsh had stayed back to cover the unit's withdrawal. He never made it to the extraction point. The only one found with him afterward was Birch, bleeding from a wound to his hindquarter, refusing to let anyone near her father's body until a Canadian medic he recognized finally talked him down. After the funeral at the cemetery off Windsor Street, Evelyn had asked, begged, really, to take Birch home. The Canadian Armed Forces saw things differently. A military working dog wasn't a family pet to be handed over in a moment of grief. He was an asset, and a valuable one, and so Birch was patched up and reassigned, first to a base perimeter unit, then quietly transferred out to a contracted security detachment after his behavior reports started piling up, because Birch was never the same dog again. His new handlers documented what they called acute behavioral deterioration, unpredictable aggression, refusal to bond episodes that looked, to anyone who'd ever lost someone suddenly, exactly like grief. Eventually he was marked unfit for further service, too dangerous to place with a civilian family, and scheduled for disposal through liquidation. It was only because of a phone call from her father's old section commander, a retired warrant officer named Robert Chen, who still checked in on Evelyn every few months, that she found out where Birch was actually headed, and when. Next item, folks, we've got a transfer lot from a federal contract just outside Gagetown. The auctioneer's voice rolled out over the warehouse PA, dragging Evelyn back into the present. He was a heavy-set man named Cole Whitlock, a former RCMP K9 handler turned auctioneer, with a voice like he gargled gravel for breakfast. Evelyn pressed herself against the cold metal barricade separating bidders from the staging area, her pulse hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The men around her bid on Dutch Shepherds and Malinois with a casualness that made her sick. 8,000. 9,500. Whitlock fired the numbers back like an auctioneer at a livestock sale, because that, functionally, was exactly what this was. Lot 31, Whitlock called eventually, glancing down at his clipboard, and something in Evelyn's chest seized. The side door of the staging pen clanged open. 2 handlers came out backward, boots skidding on the concrete, hauling against a pair of heavy catch poles. At the end of them was a 70-pound German shepherd, with a coat that had once been a rich, dark sable and was now dulled and patchy in places, a thick scar tracking down through the fur on his shoulder, and one ear notched halfway off. He was wearing a full leather agitation muzzle, and fighting it with everything he had, a low, continuous snarl rolling out of his chest like an engine that wouldn't quit. He looked nothing like the dog who used to fall asleep with his head on her lap. He looked like something built to hurt people, and underneath all of it, Evelyn could see exactly what he was, a terrified animal who'd been guarding a body in the dark for longer than anyone should have had to. Easy, easy now, Whitlock barked toward the stage, eyeing the dog with the wary respect of a man who'd handled enough of them to know better than to get close. Lot 31, German Shepherd, male, 8 years old, 3 overseas deployments. Decorated for valor under the Joint Task Force Commendation List, for those of you who care about paperwork. He flipped a page and his expression shifted, flattened out. Full disclosure, this dog has bitten 2 handlers in the last 18 months. Severe reactivity, documented trauma response. He is not suitable for patrol or detection work going forward. Recommended for solitary perimeter use only, behind serious fencing. Bidding opens at 1,000. Evelyn's hand was already shaking before she raised the paddle. 1,000, Whitlock called, scanning the floor. For a long moment, nobody moved. Even men who bought dangerous dogs for a living didn't love the idea of one who bit the people paid to control him. Evelyn lifted her paddle higher. 1,000. Her voice came out younger than she wanted it to, cracking slightly in a room that didn't have a lot of patience for cracking voices. Whitlock raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting the bid to come from a woman half the age and a quarter the budget of everyone else in the room. 1,000 to the young lady up front. Do I hear 2,000? A voice called from the back board, barely looking up from his phone. Evelyn turned. The man was mid-40s, expensively dressed in a charcoal overcoat, with the kind of smooth, unbothered confidence that came from never once worrying about money. Later she would learn his name was Grant Ashby, a regional logistics director for a private security firm that handled remote mining sites across the north. To him, the dog wasn't an animal. He was a motion-activated alarm with teeth, the cheapest kind of deterrent you could put behind a fence in the middle of nowhere. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She had $2,600 total. If she went all in now, she'd have nothing left for transport or a vet visit or food. She raised the paddle anyway. 2600. Ashby finally looked up from his phone. He studied her. The second-hand coat, the trembling hand, the desperation she wasn't hiding well enough, and something about being challenged by a young woman with nothing to lose seemed to amuse him in a way Evelyn would remember for a long time. 5,000, he said lazily, sliding the phone into his coat pocket. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a wildly inflated number for a defective dog, and everyone there knew it. Ashby wasn't bidding to win the dog. He was bidding to make a point. Evelyn's lungs stopped working properly. She had nothing left. She'd failed, and she was about to watch her father's dog get hauled off behind some chain-link fence at a mine site in the middle of the boreal forest, to live out whatever was left of his life as equipment. 5,000 going once, Whitlock said, lifting his gavel. Going twice. Evelyn ducked under the velvet rope before her brain had finished deciding to do it. Hey, miss, you can't be back there. A security guard lunged toward her too late. Evelyn was already moving, crossing straight into the 15-foot bite radius around the staging platform. The zone every sign in the building told people in 3 different colors of paint not to enter. The handlers panicked instantly. Get back now, one of them shouted, planting his boots, hauling on the catch pole with everything he had as the dog lunged toward her, hitting the end of the pole hard enough that the metal groaned. The second handler's hand dropped to a taser at his belt. The dog's eyes locked onto her, black, dilated, wild. Evelyn stopped 6 feet away. She didn't run. She straightened her spine, planted her boots, and reached, not for her own voice, soft and frightened as it was, but for the low, unhurried register her father used to use, the one that could make this exact dog freeze mid-stride on a beach full of distractions. Birch. It cracked across the warehouse like a snapped cable. The dog froze. Not slowed, froze completely, the snarl dying in his throat as if someone had cut the power to it. Evelyn took one more step, ignoring the handler still yelling at her to get back, and looked directly into those wild eyes. At ease. For Master Corporal Dan Marsh. The effect didn't just happen to Birch. The 2 handlers straining against the catch poles nearly fell over forward when the resistance simply vanished. And underneath the stage, in the rows of kennels holding nearly 24 other working dogs that had been barking and pacing and whining since the doors opened that morning, the noise stopped, not gradually. All at once, like someone had hit a switch. Within 5 seconds, the entire warehouse was holding its breath. The only sound left the hum of the lights overhead and the ragged breathing of 2 handlers who'd just had a combat-trained shepherd go still in their hands for no reason any training manual could explain. Ashby lowered his phone slowly. The security guard who'd been chasing Evelyn stood frozen halfway to her, hands still raised. Even Cole Whitlock, a man who had auctioned off more dogs than he could count, lowered his gavel with his mouth slightly open. On the platform, Birch tilted his head, his eyes, suddenly sharp and present in a way they hadn't been a moment ago, fixed on Evelyn. He lifted his nose, drawing in the scent of her coat, pulled that morning from the back of her father's closet, still faintly carrying cedar and engine grease, and something underneath that was just him. Slowly, deliberately, Birch lowered himself to sit, dead center on the stage, and let out a long, high, broken whine that didn't sound like any noise a lethal asset was supposed to make. Evelyn felt the tears come and didn't bother stopping them. Whitlock cleared his throat into the microphone, and the sound was obscene in the silence. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at her. "Miss," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "Who exactly are you? My name is Evelyn Marsh." Her voice shook, but it held. "Master Corporal Daniel Marsh was my father, and that's his dog. 50 pairs of eyes, contractors, executives, men who'd built careers around looking unbothered, moved between the young woman in the second-hand coat and the decorated military dog sitting at perfect attention in front of her, and nobody in that room said a word for a long, long moment. The silence in the depot had weight to it, the kind that pressed against your ears. Whitlock flipped to the second page of Lot 31's file, scanning the redacted transfer paperwork, his jaw tightening as he read. "Dan Marsh," he muttered into the mic, the showmanship gone out of his voice completely. "Joint Task Force, Overseas Op, Classified Theater. That's," he shook his head. "That's a hell of a story, truly. It's a very touching story," Ashby cut in, his tone dripping with the particular condescension of a man who'd never once had to fight for anything he wanted. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. "But this is a liquidation auction, Whitlock, not a memorial service. My bid of $5,000 is on the table. Let's ring it up so we can move on to the explosives detection lot." Something cold settled in Evelyn's chest, hardening into resolve. She turned to face him directly, fists clenched at her sides. "He's not an asset. He's a veteran. He guarded my father's body for hours after everyone else was gone, and you want to chain him to a fence in the bush so nobody steals your generators." Ashby's smile turned patronizing. "Sweetheart, he's a dog who bites the people who feed him. I'm doing everyone a favor, taking him off the government's hands. Step back before you get hurt." Evelyn opened her mouth to fire back, but a heavy metal folding chair scraped against the concrete somewhere at the back of the warehouse, loud enough to cut through everything else. A man rose from the last row and started walking down the center aisle, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for people they recognize without needing an introduction. He was tall, built like someone who'd spent 30 years carrying gear he wasn't supposed to be able to carry, with a gray-streaked beard and a faded scar running through it along his jaw. He wore a plain black field jacket with no insignia, which somehow made him look more serious than anyone in the room wearing tactical branding. His name was Marcus Holloway. He'd spent 2 decades in Canadian Special Operations before founding North Star Vantage, one of the most respected private extraction and security firms in the country. And before any of that, he'd served alongside Daniel Marsh. He didn't look at Ashby. He walked straight to the rope, stopped beside Evelyn, and looked down at Birch, who was tracking his every movement with an alertness that hadn't been there a minute ago. "I was on the QRF that pulled your father's unit out," Holloway said. His voice was low, rough, carrying easily across the silent room, but he wasn't talking to the crowd. He was talking to her. "When we finally broke through to his position, visibility was near zero, smoke everywhere, but we heard the dog before we saw anything else." He nodded toward Birch. "He'd taken shrapnel to the leg, lost part of an ear, and he was still standing over your dad, holding the position. 3 hostiles tried to flank in while we were still fighting our way to them. This dog took all 3 down himself, held that ground alone for almost 40 minutes before we got there." A low murmur rolled through the crowd, men who understood exactly what that meant, who'd been in rooms like that themselves. The dog on the stage stopped being a liability in their eyes and became something else entirely. Holloway finally turned to Ashby, and Ashby, for the first time all afternoon, looked smaller than the suit he was wearing. "You want to chain Dan Marsh's partner to a fence post to babysit your equipment?" Ashby straightened, trying to recover his footing. "It's an open auction. My bid stands at $5,000. If you want him, outbid me." "10," Holloway said, without a flicker of hesitation. Evelyn's breath caught. $10,000. Even the man who'd respected her father enough to step forward was about to take Birch away from her, simply because she didn't have the money to compete. 12, Ashby snapped back, color rising in his face. 50 of his peers were watching, and his pride wasn't going to let him fold quietly. 15, called a man near the wall, leaning on a cane. 18, shouted another from the front row. 22,000, Holloway said, flat and final, his eyes never leaving Ashby's. Ashby threw his hands up. "This is absurd. You're inflating the price of a defective animal out of nostalgia." He turned and stalked toward the exit, muttering something under his breath that nobody bothered repeating. Holloway looked up at Whitlock. 22, Close it out. The gavel cracked against the block. Going once, going twice, sold. Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. Birch had been saved from Ashby, but he was still, technically, somebody's property now, just not hers. Holloway reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook, scrawling something fast before tearing the check free and holding it out to her. It was made out to the Atlantic Tactical K9 liquidation auction for $22,000. The memo line read, simply, "For Dan, I didn't buy the dog, kid," he said, a tired, gentle smile breaking through the scar along his jaw. "You did. I just covered the difference. I can't pay this back," Evelyn whispered, staring at the number. "I have $2,600. It would take me years. Your father pulled me out of a vehicle that was on fire outside Kandahar in 2009, Holloway said quietly. "I've been carrying that for a long time. Today the books are even. Take the check, Evelyn. Take your boy home." She signed the transfer paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Whitlock stamped it with a heavy, final thud and called the handlers forward. Lot 31 transferred to civilian custody. "Bring him down." The handlers hesitated, glancing at each other, because regardless of what had just happened, the dog was still classified as a Level 4 behavioral risk. "Ma'am, we'll need to crate him for transport. He's still in restraint for a reason. If he comes out of whatever this is, he could seriously hurt you." "Let him go," Evelyn said, her own voice this time, not her father's. "Steady. I can't authorize that." "Drop the poles," Holloway said, stepping in behind her, and there wasn't a person in that warehouse who was going to argue with him twice. The handlers unclipped the catches. The poles clattered to the floor. 50 armed and trained men quietly braced for the worst. Evelyn dropped to her knees on the cold concrete, making herself small, palms turned up and open. Birch took one step, then another. He closed the last few feet between them and pressed his scarred head against her chest, breathing in the scent that had been sitting in her father's closet for 3 years, untouched, waiting for this. A shudder ran through his entire body. He let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a bark, but something closer to a sob, and folded his full weight into her, leaning so hard she nearly tipped backward. "I've got you," she whispered into the fur where his ear used to be whole. "I've got you. You're done. You're coming home." She found the buckle of the agitation muzzle with trembling fingers. One of the handlers started forward. "Wait, careful." And Holloway cut him off with a single look. Evelyn unfastened the strap and pulled the muzzle free, letting it fall to the concrete. Birch didn't snap. He didn't growl. He dragged his tongue once across her wet cheek and made a low, rhythmic sound in his chest that she hadn't heard from him since she was a teenager on a back porch in Shearwater. She stood, legs unsteady, and clipped a plain nylon leash to his collar. "Heel," she said softly. Birch fell into position against her left leg instantly, perfectly, like no time had passed at all. As she walked the length of the warehouse toward the exit, the contractors and executives who'd spent the afternoon bidding on dogs like they were spare parts stepped back, clearing a path without anyone asking them to. Some nodded. A few simply looked at the floor. It wasn't a young woman and a dog leaving a building. It was a fallen soldier's legacy being walked out the only way any of them knew how to honor it. A year later, the wind off the northwest arm carried the smell of salt and cut grass across a small back porch in Halifax, where Evelyn sat with a stack of nursing textbooks balanced on her knees, half studying for an exam she wasn't worried about anymore. At her feet, sprawled in a patch of late afternoon sun, lay a German shepherd whose coat had filled back in dark and glossy. The scar along his shoulder faded to a thin, pale line. He twitched in his sleep, chasing something. Gulls, maybe, or nothing at all anymore. He didn't pace at night. He didn't flinch at sudden sounds the way he used to. Birch's war, as far as anyone could tell, was finally over. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, lying at the feet of the daughter of the man he never stopped guarding, both of them finally, quietly, home.